Hey YouTube, it's Mr. B here coming at you with another English Essentials vid. I'm very excited about today's video, especially because it's so timely and we know that those English Language Paper 2s are exactly around the corner. So, before we get into it, let's remember, smash that like button, please hit subscribe and also tap on the notification bell so that you never miss out on any amazing videos. Right. Today's video, we are going to be looking at the following 4 areas. One, we're going to be unpacking what the question means so that you won't be phased because AQA they can sometimes try to catch us out. The second thing we're going to be doing is thinking about how we respond to the question. We're then going to be looking at a modeled outcome, and finally, stay to the end of the video. We'll be having a look at some of those pitfalls, and so you'll want to make sure you stay for that. Okay, as always, please make sure you grab a pen, maybe a snack, and let's dive right in. Okay, so let's start off with what is this question about? Now, this question here on the surface seems pretty straightforward, right? No. The question at times can be quite tricky, but why? Well, it's tricky for 3 reasons, as you can see on the screen. The first reason is to do with the wording of the question. The wording of the question is a bit misleading from AQA. The second reason why this question is a bit tricky is the demands of the question. It's very hard for teenagers to go into an exam hall, read 2 completely different texts that they've never seen before, bring them together and compare a very minute piece of detail. I'm going to be honest with you, nowhere in real life will they ever expect you to do this. This is just something for the exam. Okay, so the demands of the question is really difficult. And finally, it's the time constraints. You have to be able to read the text very quickly, and you have to be able to compare them very quickly, bring them together, and all of those 3 things coming together makes this question incredibly tricky. But don't worry, fear not, we're going to get there, guys. Question came from a previous AQA paper, and let's have a look at what it says. You need to refer to source A and source B for this question. The writers in source A and B stay in very different campsites. Use details from both sources to write a summary of what you understand about the differences between the 2 camping sites. And I can tell you that from the beginning, the reason why this question is so tricky is because of the way in which they have worded it. So the question says, use details from both sources to write a summary. Now, if I was to ask you, what is a summary? Or to summarize what happened this morning, summarize what you did on holiday, that would be very different from what the examiner wants you to do when they ask you to summarize. So rather than think about this question as a summary, think about this question rather as asking you to infer. Write about the information and what you can infer. So mentally, use the details from both sources to write about what you can infer about the differences between the 2 campsites. And the better the inferences, the better your response will be. Okay, so this question is really asking you to do 2 things. It's asking you to synthesize, bring the texts together, find a commonality and bring them together. And then the second thing it's asking you to do is to infer. So it wants you to arrive at a conclusion based on the evidence. So for example, if it asks you about the campsite, it wants you to look at the campsites from the information given to you about the campsites. What can you tell? And if you do that, you can't go wrong. Let's now have a look at the mark scheme, because I've talked to you about synthesis and I've talked to you about inference, but why? Let's have a look. Even at level 2 on AQA's mark scheme, it says that the candidate must attempt some inference from both texts, and that's to get at least 3 marks here out of the 8. If you want to get to level 3, you must also synthesize, and that's what I keep going on about. Bringing the text together is synthesizing, showing a clear synthesis, it says, and interpretation of both text. So that must mean it's a personal response and you have brought them together. And that's just one of the reasons why this one is a bit more challenging than some of the others. So when we get into the exam, it's not enough for us for this question to just dive right into the question. We really have to think about how we're going to plan our response. Now, obviously, you can see the table in front of you. It's quite a lot, but it's just for you a framework or a guide to think about how you want to be answering this question. So the first thing you want to be considering is, what do you notice, for example, about both of the campsites? And if we have a look at the example I've provided you here, on one hand we can see that it says for source A, established holiday destination, and that it's a good quality. And on the other hand, we can see that it's hurried and unsophisticated, therefore a poor quality. And what you also want to be considering is, what evidence is there to support this? So the first thing is coming up with that idea. It's linked to both texts, and then what evidence is there, what references can I use to support my ideas. The second bit, and this really is the most crucial bit, that what's going to separate the wheat from the chaff, is making that inference. For source A, what inferences? Look at the example there. There is a table tennis hut, and from that I can infer that it meets the demands of the campers. From that I can infer that it's pleasurable. From that I can infer that it's relaxing. And you can see the same for source B. This is what we would call a model answer, and this comes from AQA. Now, English is brilliant, but it's also a little bit annoying. And let me tell you why, and not for the reasons you think. It's a bit annoying because the answer is not black and white like it is in, let's say, maths. It's a bit more subjective. And so, for example, I could give you 8 out of 8, and another teacher could give you 7 out of 8, and they're both correct. There is something called tolerance, which means that the examiner can give you 2 different grades and both are A-OK, which is why when your papers get remarked, very rarely do they change the grades. Let's have a look at this response here. Before we read the response, I want to draw your attention to the mark scheme and what's called the indicative content. So it says, shows perceptive and detailed synthesis and interpretation of both texts. And in order to do that, makes perceptive inferences from both texts, selects judicious, carefully chosen references, and also statements show perceptive differences between the text. Now, but without even reading it, if you have a look at the colours, you can see just how much weight AQA place on the ability to infer. Nearly all of that is pink. That is your sign that this question is really an inference question, and that's where the most of your time should be spent. Let's have a look at Mr. B's response. So, both sources explore the different range of facilities available at the different campsites. While source A's campsite offers a range of amenities such as a tennis court and pool, source B offers none of the basic modern comforts found in source A. I want to pause here for a second. Notice how I'm constantly flitting between the 2 texts and the 2 sources. I'm constantly trying to make my response feel like it's synthesized. That's far better than having a block of source A and then a block of source B. Rather, source B highlights that the campsite had turned into a series of streaming rivers. This leads me to infer. Don't be afraid to use that phrase. This leads me to infer. Now, obviously, we don't want those of you at the top end, the grade 8s, the grade 9s, having all of your responses really formulaic, but using the word infer is never going to be wrong. This leads me to infer that the campsite in source A would have offered a more relaxed experience, while source B appears minimalistic, uncomfortable, and miserable. And that feels okay. And we're going to get something quite good if we do 2 of those paragraphs. So this is what we stuck around for, the pitfalls, the kind of errors that I consistently see every year with my year 10s and my year 11s. Okay, so the first error is this. Many kids keep discussing the methods. You do not need to talk about the language or the structure for this question. Forget about that. Number 2, the steer of the question. AQA want you to be very, very specific. If it asks you about the campsites, talk about the campsites only. Don't talk about the experience of the campers. Don't talk about the journey to the campsite. Talk about the campsite itself. Respond to the steer of the question. Number 3, you must refer to both sources. If you don't do that, you will be capped. You must refer to both sources. And last one, synthesis. We have to compare apples and apples. We cannot do this apples and oranges. On one hand, source A talks about X, and in source B, they talk about Y. We must make sure we get that right. Another thing that AQA have said they want to make sure that we do is making sure that we are not using these negations, if you will. You cannot say, in source A, it's like this, however, in source B, it's not like this. That won't work. So just be very, very clear about how we're doing that. That's it for today, gang. Thank you so much for staying with me. Please don't forget, as always, to smash that like button, hit subscribe, and turn on those bell notifications so you don't miss out on any content. You know how it is. Keep those pens sharp and those minds sharper. Until next time, this has been English Essentials. Have a good one.